Welcome back, my friends. Today, I want to share the incredible story of a man who lost his freedom for many years but never lost his belief in justice. A man who faced hatred and discrimination, yet chose peace and understanding instead of anger. His name was Nelson Mandela, and his journey would not only transform South Africa but also inspire millions of people around the world. If you enjoy learning English through real-life stories about extraordinary people, you're in the right place. Now, let's travel back in time to South Africa, a country where a person's opportunities, rights, and future were often decided by the color of their skin. Nelson Mandela was born on July 18, 1918, in the small village of Mbizo. His original name was Rolihlahla Mandela. In his native language, the name can be translated as, one who causes trouble. It may have seemed like a simple name at the time, but it would later describe a man who challenged unfair laws and refused to accept injustice. As a child, Nelson grew up among the rolling hills of the Eastern Cape. His father was an important leader in the local community, and his family lived a traditional life. Young Nelson spent his days playing with friends, looking after animals, and exploring the countryside. In the evenings, he would sit and listen to the older members of the community as they shared stories around the fire. They spoke about courageous warriors, respected leaders, and people who had fought to protect their communities. Those stories captured Nelson's imagination and planted the first seeds of leadership in his mind. At that time, he had no idea that one day people around the world would tell stories about him as well. As Nelson grew older, his life began to change. When he was only 9 years old, his father died. Losing his father was a painful experience, but it also opened a new chapter in his life. After his father's death, a respected leader named Janjantaba Dalindyebo became his guardian and welcomed him into the royal household of the Thembu people. For the first time, Nelson was able to observe how important leaders made decisions. He noticed that good leaders did not simply tell people what to do. Instead, they listened carefully. They allowed everyone to speak before reaching a conclusion. These lessons would stay with him for the rest of his life. Nelson continued his education and quickly became known as a hardworking student. He loved reading and learning about the world around him. At school, one of his teachers gave him an English name, Nelson. During that period, it was common for African students to receive English names as part of the education system. As he grew older, Nelson became increasingly aware of the inequalities in South Africa. He noticed that white citizens enjoyed privileges that black citizens did not have. Opportunities were not equal. Rights were not equal. Freedom was not equal. The more he learned, the more questions he asked. Why should some people have more rights than others? Why should someone's skin color determine their future? These questions stayed in his mind as he continued his studies. Eventually, Nelson attended the University College of Fort Hare, one of the few institutions where black students could receive higher education. There he met many intelligent young people who shared similar concerns about the future of South Africa. Students often gathered to discuss politics, justice, and social change. They dreamed of building a fairer society where everyone would have equal opportunities. Nelson enjoyed these discussions, but he was not interested in talking alone. He believed that action was also important. During his time at the university, a disagreement developed between students and administrators. Many students felt that their voices were being ignored. Nelson joined a student protest demanding better representation. The protest did not end well. As a result of his participation, he was expelled from the university. For many young people, such a setback might have ended their ambitions. Nelson saw it differently. He viewed challenges as opportunities to grow stronger. After leaving university, he returned to the home of his guardian. However, another surprise awaited him. Janjantaba had arranged a marriage for Nelson. At the time, arranged marriages were a respected tradition in many communities. But Nelson felt that he was not ready. He wanted to make his own choices and build his own future. Faced with a difficult decision, he chose a path that would change his life forever. He left home and traveled to Johannesburg. Johannesburg was unlike anything he had ever seen before. The city was crowded, busy, and full of energy. Tall buildings stood where open fields once existed. People from different backgrounds filled the streets. New opportunities seemed to exist around every corner. But alongside those opportunities, Nelson also witnessed something troubling. The racial discrimination that existed throughout South Africa was especially visible in the city. Black South Africans faced restrictions everywhere. Many jobs were reserved for white workers. Many neighborhoods were closed to black families. Many public services treated people differently depending on their race. Every day, Nelson saw ordinary people suffering under unfair laws. Determined to continue his education, he worked various jobs while studying part-time. Life was often difficult, and money was limited, but he refused to give up. Eventually, he began studying law. This was an important turning point. As a law student, Nelson discovered how powerful laws could be. Laws could protect people and create justice. But they could also be used to control, exclude, and oppress. The more he learned, the more convinced he became that South Africa needed change. Around this time, he met activists, thinkers, and community leaders who were already working to challenge the system. They believed that every citizen deserved equal rights and equal opportunities. Their ideas inspired him. Their determination motivated him. And before long, Nelson Mandela would take his first steps into organized political activism. The struggle that would define his life was about to begin. In 1944, Nelson Mandela joined the African National Congress, better known as the ANC. The ANC was an organization that worked to defend the rights of black South Africans. At the time, many of its leaders believed that peaceful discussions and petitions could convince the government to change its policies. Nelson respected these efforts, but he also felt that stronger action was necessary. Together with other young activists, he helped create the ANC Youth League. This group wanted to bring new energy to the movement. They believed that people needed to organize, protest, and speak out against injustice. For Nelson, this was the beginning of a new chapter. He was no longer just a student observing problems around him. He was becoming a leader. During these years, Nelson continued studying law. Eventually, he became one of the few black lawyers in South Africa. Along with his friend Oliver Tambo, he opened a law office in Johannesburg. Their office quickly became a place where many black South Africans came for help. Every day, people arrived with stories of discrimination. Some had lost their homes. Others had been arrested because of unfair laws. Many simply wanted someone to listen to them. Nelson saw firsthand how apartheid was affecting ordinary families. The word apartheid means separateness. It was a system designed to keep people of different races apart. Under apartheid, black South Africans had very few rights. They could not vote. They could not live wherever they wanted. They often received poorer education and healthcare. Many opportunities were reserved for white citizens. As the years passed, the government introduced even more restrictions. Instead of improving, the situation became worse. Nelson and other activists knew they could not remain silent. In 1952, the ANC launched an important campaign known as the Defiance Campaign. Thousands of people participated. They deliberately challenged unfair laws. Some entered areas reserved for white people. Others refused to carry documents that the government required black citizens to have at all times. The goal was simple: to show the world that these laws were unjust. Many participants were arrested. Nelson himself faced constant pressure from the authorities. Government officials watched his activities closely. They restricted where he could travel. They limited the meetings he could attend. But none of this stopped him. In fact, the more obstacles he faced, the more determined he became. As his reputation grew, people across South Africa began to recognize his name. Many saw him as a symbol of hope. A man who was willing to speak when others were afraid. A man who refused to accept injustice as normal. In 1955, activists from different communities came together to create an important document called the Freedom Charter. This document described their vision for the future. It declared that South Africa belonged to all who lived there, regardless of race. It called for equal rights, equal opportunities, and democratic elections. For many people, the Freedom Charter represented a dream. A dream of a country where everyone could live with dignity and freedom. The government, however, viewed it as a threat. Officials feared that the growing movement would challenge their power. As a result, they responded harshly. In 1956, Nelson Mandela and many other activists were arrested. They were accused of treason, one of the most serious crimes a person could face. The trial lasted for years. Year after year, the accused appeared in court. Year after year, uncertainty followed them. Many wondered whether they would spend the rest of their lives in prison. Yet throughout the trial, Nelson remained calm. He continued speaking about justice. He continued believing that change was possible. Finally, after several years, the court found the accused not guilty. It was a major victory. But while the trial was ending, tensions in South Africa were rising. Anger was growing. Frustration was growing. People were becoming increasingly desperate. Then, in 1960, a tragic event shocked the nation. In a town called Sharpeville, hundreds of people gathered to protest peacefully against apartheid laws. They carried no weapons. They simply wanted their voices to be heard. But the situation turned deadly. Police opened fire on the crowd. Dozens of people were killed. Many others were injured. News of the massacre spread around the world. People everywhere were horrified. For Nelson Mandela, Sharpeville became a turning point. For many years, he had believed that peaceful protest could bring change. Now he began to question whether peaceful methods alone would be enough. The government seemed unwilling to listen. It seemed determined to silence opposition by force. As South Africa entered one of the most dangerous periods in its history, Nelson Mandela faced a difficult decision. The path ahead would be risky. It would change his life forever. And soon, the government would begin its biggest effort yet to stop him. After the Sharpeville massacre, Nelson Mandela faced one of the most difficult decisions of his life. For many years, he and other activists had organized peaceful protests, marches, and campaigns. They believed that change could be achieved without violence. But the events at Sharpeville shook that belief. Peaceful protesters had been met with bullets. Many activists felt that the government was leaving them with fewer and fewer options. At the same time, the South African government increased its efforts to silence opposition. The African National Congress was banned. Its meetings became illegal. Many leaders were arrested. Others were forced into hiding. Despite the danger, Nelson refused to stop fighting for freedom. In 1961, he helped create a new organization called Umkhonto we Sizwe, which means, Spear of the Nation. The group planned acts of sabotage against government facilities. Their goal was not to harm civilians. Instead, they wanted to damage symbols of the apartheid system and show that resistance would continue. Nelson knew the risks. Every decision could lead to arrest. Every meeting could be his last as a free man. To avoid capture, he began living in secret. He moved from place to place. He often stayed in different houses. Sometimes he traveled at night. Sometimes he wore disguises. Because he was so difficult to find, journalists gave him a nickname. They called him the Black Pimpernel. For months, Nelson managed to avoid the police. During this period, he secretly left South Africa and traveled to several African countries. He met political leaders. He sought support for the struggle against apartheid. He also received military training. When he returned home, he continued working underground. But the government was determined to catch him. In August 1962, Nelson Mandela was finally arrested. Police stopped the car he was traveling in and took him into custody. The news spread quickly across the country. Many supporters feared that they might never see him free again. A court sentenced him to 5 years in prison. For a moment, it seemed that this would be the end of his political activities. But something even bigger was about to happen. In 1963, police raided a secret farm in Rivonia, near Johannesburg. The farm had been used by anti-apartheid activists. During the raid, officers discovered important documents and evidence linking several leaders to resistance activities. Soon, Nelson Mandela and other activists were charged with serious crimes. The government accused them of sabotage and plotting against the state. The punishment could be death. The trial that followed became known as the Rivonia trial. People around the world watched closely. Many feared that Nelson and his companions would be executed. Inside the courtroom, Nelson understood that the outcome could change his life forever. Instead of remaining silent, he decided to speak. His statement became one of the most famous speeches in modern history. He explained why he had fought against apartheid. He described the suffering experienced by millions of black South Africans. He spoke about freedom, equality, and democracy. Then he shared words that would be remembered for generations. He said that he had dedicated his life to the struggle for a democratic society where all people could live together with equal opportunities. And if necessary, he was prepared to die for that ideal. The courtroom fell silent. The judges listened. The world listened. Many expected the worst. But when the verdict finally arrived in 1964, Nelson Mandela was not sentenced to death. Instead, he and several other leaders received life imprisonment. For some people, life imprisonment sounded almost as terrible as a death sentence. Many believed Nelson would spend the rest of his life behind bars. At the age of 46, he was taken to Robben Island, a prison located off the coast of Cape Town. The island would become one of the most famous prisons in history. Life there was extremely difficult. Prisoners slept on thin mats placed directly on the floor. The cells were small and cold. Food was limited. The work was exhausting. Every day, prisoners were forced to work in a limestone quarry under the hot African sun. The bright white stone reflected sunlight into their eyes for hours. Many prisoners later suffered permanent vision problems. The prison authorities hoped these harsh conditions would break the prisoners' spirits. They wanted them to lose hope. They wanted them to give up. But Nelson Mandela surprised everyone. Instead of becoming bitter, he became stronger. Instead of surrendering, he became an example to the other prisoners. Even inside prison walls, he continued leading. And although he could not know it yet, the years ahead would transform him into a symbol of freedom for people all around the world. Life on Robben Island was extremely hard. Every morning, Nelson Mandela and the other prisoners woke up in small cells with very few comforts. The food was poor, the work was exhausting, and the rules were strict. The prison authorities wanted the prisoners to feel powerless. They wanted them to believe that resistance was useless. But Nelson refused to let prison control his mind. He believed that even though his body was confined, his ideas and his hopes remained free. Each day, he looked for ways to improve himself. He read books whenever he could. He studied history, politics, and law. He encouraged other prisoners to do the same. Soon, many inmates began learning from one another. They discussed ideas. They shared knowledge. They taught each other different subjects. Over time, Robben Island became known among prisoners as Mandela's University. Education became a form of resistance. The prison guards could control their movements, but they could not stop them from learning. Nelson also believed in treating people with dignity, even those who treated him unfairly. Many guards expected him to be angry and hostile. Instead, he remained calm and respectful. He listened carefully when people spoke. He tried to understand different perspectives. Some guards were surprised by his attitude. As the years passed, several of them developed respect for him. Nelson understood something important. If South Africa was ever going to change, people would eventually need to talk to one another. Hatred alone would not solve the country's problems. Meanwhile, life outside the prison continued. The world was changing. Across South Africa, resistance against apartheid was growing stronger. More people joined protests. More organizations demanded equal rights. International attention also increased. Many countries criticized the South African government. Students, musicians, athletes, and political leaders around the world began calling for Mandela's release. His name became known far beyond South Africa. People who had never met him carried signs that said, "Free Nelson Mandela." Songs were written about him. Demonstrations were organized in cities across the globe. For millions of people, Mandela became a symbol of courage and hope. Inside prison, however, life remained difficult. The years passed slowly. 5 years. 10 years. 15 years. Then 20 years. Imagine watching entire decades disappear while living behind prison walls. During this time, Nelson experienced great personal pain. His family suffered because of his imprisonment. His wife, Winnie Mandela, faced constant harassment from the authorities. She was frequently questioned, arrested, and restricted by the government. His children grew up without him. Many important family moments passed by. Some losses were especially heartbreaking. When Nelson's mother died, he was not allowed to attend her funeral. Later, one of his sons died in a car accident. Again, he was denied permission to attend the funeral. The emotional pain was enormous. Yet Nelson continued moving forward. He exercised every day. He maintained a routine. He stayed mentally strong. Most importantly, he never abandoned his vision for the future. As the 1980s progressed, South Africa faced increasing problems. The economy was struggling. International sanctions were damaging trade. Violence and protests were becoming more common. Many government leaders began to realize that apartheid could not continue forever. Pressure was coming from every direction. Eventually, government officials started considering a new possibility. What if they negotiated with Nelson Mandela? What if they spoke with the man they had imprisoned for decades? At first, the idea seemed impossible. But slowly, secret discussions began. Government representatives met with Mandela. They talked about South Africa's future. They discussed how to avoid a civil war. They explored the possibility of a peaceful transition. Nelson approached these conversations carefully. He knew that millions of people were depending on him. He wanted freedom. But he wanted freedom for everyone, not only for himself. Over the years, prison officials moved him to different facilities with better conditions. By the late 1980s, it was becoming clear that change was approaching. The government could no longer ignore reality. Apartheid was weakening. The demand for equality was growing stronger every day. And after more than 2 decades behind bars, Nelson Mandela was about to experience a moment that many people had waited years to see. The moment when the prison gates would finally open. On February 11, 1990, a moment that once seemed impossible finally arrived. After 27 years in prison, Nelson Mandela was released. People across South Africa gathered near the prison gates. Television cameras from around the world waited for his first appearance. Millions of people watched. Many wondered what he would say. Many wondered what kind of man would emerge after spending nearly 3 decades behind bars. Would he be angry? Would he seek revenge? Would he call for conflict? Then Nelson Mandela appeared. He walked out of prison with confidence. His head was held high. His fist was raised in the air. Beside him was his wife, Winnie. The crowd erupted with cheers. Some people cried. Others sang. For many South Africans, this was a day they thought they might never see. Mandela was now 71 years old. He had lost many years of freedom. But he had not lost his purpose. In his first public speeches after his release, Nelson thanked those who had supported the struggle against apartheid. However, he made one thing very clear. The fight was not over. South Africa was still not a democracy. Millions of people still lacked equal rights. There was still much work to do. The following years were some of the most important and difficult of Mandela's life. He began negotiating with the South African government. The goal was to peacefully end apartheid and create a democratic nation. These negotiations were not easy. Many people distrusted one another. Some groups wanted revenge. Others feared losing power. Violence continued in several parts of the country. At times, it seemed as though South Africa might fall into civil war. But Mandela remained focused on peace. He believed that the future depended on bringing people together. Again and again, he encouraged dialogue instead of violence. He met with political opponents. He listened to different viewpoints. He asked people to imagine a country where everyone could live together as equals. Many people found this remarkable. After everything he had suffered, Mandela still spoke about reconciliation. He still spoke about forgiveness. He understood that building a new nation required more than changing laws. It required healing old wounds. One of his most famous beliefs was simple. If people continued hating one another, South Africa would never move forward. The country needed unity. Not because the past should be forgotten, but because the future mattered too much. In 1993, Nelson Mandela and South African President F.W. de Klerk received the Nobel Peace Prize. The award recognized their efforts to peacefully dismantle apartheid and build a democratic future. It was a historic moment. Two former enemies standing together, working toward the same goal. The following year, South Africa prepared for something extraordinary. For the first time in its history, citizens of all races would be allowed to vote in a national election. Excitement spread throughout the country. People traveled long distances to participate. Some waited in line for hours. Others waited all day. Many elderly citizens were voting for the first time in their lives. For decades, they had been denied that right. Now they finally had a voice. On April 27, 1994, history was made. The election was peaceful. Millions cast their votes. And when the results were announced, Nelson Mandela's party, the African National Congress, had won. A few weeks later, on May 10, 1994, Nelson Mandela became the first black president of South Africa. The man who had once been considered an enemy of the state was now the leader of the nation. World leaders attended his inauguration. People celebrated across the country. For many South Africans, it felt like the beginning of a new era. During his speech, Mandela spoke about freedom, unity, and hope. He promised to serve all South Africans, regardless of race or background. His message was simple. The future belonged to everyone. Not just one group. Not just one community. Everyone. The journey from prisoner to president was complete. But Mandela knew that becoming president was not the end of the story. In many ways, the hardest work was only beginning. South Africa still faced poverty. Many communities remained divided. The wounds of apartheid were still fresh. Now Mandela had to help heal an entire nation. And that challenge would become the next chapter of his remarkable life. When Nelson Mandela became president in 1994, many people believed South Africa had reached the end of its struggle. But Mandela knew that winning an election was only the beginning. The country had spent decades divided by fear, discrimination, and violence. Millions of people had suffered under apartheid. Families had been separated. Communities had been destroyed. Trust between different groups was extremely fragile. The question now was not how to win freedom, The question was how to build peace. Many people expected Mandela to punish those who had supported apartheid. Some believed he would remove white officials from positions of power. Others feared that revenge would lead to even more conflict. But Mandela had a different vision. He believed that South Africa could not move forward if its people remained trapped by anger and hatred. Instead of focusing on revenge, he focused on reconciliation. He wanted black and white South Africans to build a future together. This was not always a popular decision. Some people felt that forgiveness was too generous. Others felt that justice required punishment. Mandela understood these feelings. After all, he had spent 27 years in prison. He had every reason to be bitter. Yet he chose another path. One of his most important actions was supporting the creation of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. This special commission allowed victims of apartheid to tell their stories publicly. People who had suffered abuse, violence, or discrimination could finally speak about what had happened to them. At the same time, individuals who had committed crimes during apartheid could confess their actions. If they told the complete truth, they could sometimes receive amnesty instead of punishment. The process was emotional and often painful. Many heartbreaking stories were revealed. Families learned what had happened to loved ones who had disappeared years earlier. Victims finally had the opportunity to be heard. The goal was not simply to punish people. The goal was to uncover the truth and help the country heal. Although the process was not perfect, it helped South Africa avoid a cycle of revenge that might have led to more violence. Mandela also looked for symbolic ways to unite the nation. One famous example involved rugby. At that time, rugby was largely associated with white South Africans. Many black citizens viewed the national rugby team as a symbol of the old system. In 1995, South Africa hosted the Rugby World Cup. Instead of ignoring the event, Mandela embraced it. He appeared wearing the jersey of the national team, the Springboks. Many people were surprised. Some were even shocked. But Mandela understood the power of symbols. He wanted all South Africans to feel that they belonged to the same country. When South Africa won the tournament, people from different backgrounds celebrated together. It became one of the most powerful moments of national unity in the country's history. Meanwhile, Mandela's government worked to improve people's lives. New houses were built. Access to healthcare expanded. More children gained opportunities to attend school. The challenges remained enormous, but progress was being made. Mandela traveled throughout the country listening to citizens. He visited communities that had been ignored for years. He encouraged people to participate in building a democratic society. Around the world, Mandela became one of the most admired leaders on earth. Presidents wanted to meet him. Universities awarded him honors. Crowds gathered wherever he went. Yet despite his fame, Mandela remained remarkably humble. He often reminded people that South Africa's success belonged to millions of ordinary citizens, not just to one individual. As his presidential term continued, many supporters hoped he would remain in power for many years. His popularity was extraordinary. Winning another election would likely have been easy. But Mandela believed that democracy was stronger than any single leader. He wanted to show that no person should become more important than the institutions of a democratic nation. So when his first term ended in 1999, he made a decision that surprised many people. He chose not to run for president again. Instead, he stepped down peacefully and handed power to a new leader. This decision strengthened South Africa's young democracy. It demonstrated that leadership was about service, not personal power. By the time Mandela left office, he had achieved something few people thought possible. A country once divided by apartheid had become a democracy. Former enemies were working together. The threat of civil war had been avoided. The world admired what South Africa had accomplished. But Nelson Mandela's work was not finished yet. Even after leaving the presidency, he would continue fighting for justice, education, health, and human dignity. His final years would add another remarkable chapter to an already extraordinary life. After leaving the presidency in 1999, Nelson Mandela could have chosen a quiet life. He had already achieved more than most people could ever imagine. He had helped end apartheid. He had become South Africa's first black president. He had earned the respect of people all around the world. Many believed he deserved a peaceful retirement. But Nelson Mandela was not ready to stop helping others. Although he no longer held political office, he continued working for causes he cared deeply about. One of those causes was education. Mandela believed that education could change lives. He often encouraged young people to study, learn, and never stop asking questions. He understood that knowledge gives people opportunities and helps create a better future. Another cause close to his heart was healthcare. During the early 2000s, Africa faced a serious HIV/AIDS crisis. Millions of people were affected by the disease. At that time, many people were afraid to talk openly about it. There was fear, misunderstanding, and stigma. Mandela decided to use his voice to raise awareness. He encouraged people to learn the facts and support those who were suffering. His message helped bring global attention to the issue. Even in his later years, Mandela continued traveling, meeting leaders, supporting charities, and speaking about peace and justice. Wherever he went, people listened. Not because he was famous, but because his life had given his words special meaning. He had experienced suffering. He had experienced loss. He had experienced injustice. And yet he continued to believe in hope. Over time, however, age began to slow him down. After decades of service, Mandela gradually reduced his public activities. He spent more time with his family and close friends. The man who had spent so many years fighting for freedom could finally enjoy moments of peace. Yet his influence never disappeared. Young leaders continued learning from his example. Students continued studying his speeches. Communities around the world continued celebrating his message of forgiveness and reconciliation. On December 5, 2013, Nelson Mandela passed away at the age of 95. News of his death spread quickly across the world. People from every continent paid tribute to him. Presidents, kings, athletes, teachers, and ordinary citizens shared messages of respect and gratitude. Many remembered him as a great leader. Others remembered him as a symbol of courage. Many simply remembered him as a man who never gave up. South Africa declared a period of mourning. Thousands of people gathered to honor his memory. His life was celebrated not only in his own country but across the globe. Although Nelson Mandela was gone, his legacy remained. His story continues to inspire new generations. It reminds us that change is possible, even when challenges seem impossible to overcome. It reminds us that true leadership is not about power. It is about serving others. It reminds us that forgiveness can be stronger than hatred. And it reminds us that one person can help transform an entire nation. Nelson Mandela once said, "Education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world." His own life proved that change begins when people refuse to accept injustice and continue believing in a better future. So, my friends, this is the story of Nelson Mandela. A boy from a small village who grew up listening to stories around a fire. A young man who dared to challenge an unfair system. A prisoner who spent 27 years behind bars. A leader who chose peace over revenge. And a president who helped unite a divided nation. His journey was not easy. His sacrifices were enormous. But his determination changed history. I hope this story has inspired you and helped you practice your English at the same time. Thank you for spending this time with me and learning about one of the most remarkable people in modern history. Until next time, keep learning, keep growing, and remember that even small actions can help create a better world. If you liked it, leave a like and subscribe. See you in the next story.